Today we talked about children and death.
And why it's important.
And we answered some Q&As today.
I think we did.
So let's get to the episode.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Capal, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Capal, a psychotherapist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
So let's talk about death.
Let's talk about it, Nick. On today's episode, we're going to talk about how to get children involved, and maybe a little bit of maybe some pointers, some things that you never thought about when it comes to children and young individuals dealing with grief, loss, and death, of course.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about it. So, from my personal experience, I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of parents say some different things to kids. I'm going to first start out with the scenario of an older death. So grandma, grandpa, uncle, great uncle, cousin. Usually what happens is, in some cases, this is the first experience that these children have ever had at a funeral home. And we even get asked, Dad and I get asked occasionally in the arrangement conference, should we bring our kids? Let's start with that thought.
So I think to really recap this, though, you got to go with the history. Children were around the dead all the time because back in the day, we used to take care of the dying in our own homes. So the kids were always around it. They got to see grandma go through the stages of death and die. So when the death occurred and then, let's fast forward to the funeral, they used to lay out the bodies in the homes. So the living room, that's where you'd put grandma and grandpa. You'd lay them out there. And then everybody, friends, families would come visit the house and pay their respects. Now that we're in the day and era where things have changed from, laying out families in the home, we lay them out in the funeral home. And where do they die? They die in nursing homes or hospitals. Now there is a change back to hospice. We'll talk about that later in another episode. But for the most part, most elderly people die in nursing homes or hospitals, which unfortunately a lot of the children don't get to either experience nor witness. So now we're in a day of era where they're not witnessing death at all. And there's a lot of parents out there that shield their kids from death. I've heard that multiple times that, we didn't bring, because I see the kids in therapy. So the problem is that, grandma or grandpa died. That's what normally I see with the little ones. And then they're left with this idea of what happened to grandma and grandpa. They just, one day were there, the next day they're gone. The parents have a struggle, I think, explaining to them what death is, because I think a lot of people struggle with the idea of death in general. So when it comes down the line, the kids are left with a lot of questions, unanswered questions. But also, we also teach our kids that most of the time it's inappropriate to talk about death. So now we got grandpa, grandma who passes on. The kid is stuck with a lot of questions / grief because now they don't have one of their closest companions. For some of them, their best friends. So the problem becomes this idea that if we don't allow kids to talk about death on a normal basis and they don't get to view it, they don't get to see it, and then furthermore down the line they don't get to go to the funeral, then we're saying that death doesn't exist to these kids. And
right, we're sheltering them from an inevitable problem that they're going to come. You can't shelter a kid from death. Death is coming. Death is coming to all, and they're eventually going to experience just like everything. Kids are sponges. You don't have to go, what I found is you don't have to go really in depth with what's going on. Just give them the basics of what's going on. You're going to go to a visitation. There are going to be people there that knew grandpa, knew the family. You might see people crying. That's part of it. You're going to see grandpa, if it's a casket, in a casket. His feet are in there. You can have the funeral director show you. You can go up in normal situations. Right now we're in a pandemic, so we don't have that opportunity, but You can go up and touch grandpa if you want. What I find with children is they're going to tell you what they want to do and what they don't want to do. So if they don't feel comfortable, they're going to tell you, and that's okay, and that's fine. But I still think every child should have at least the opportunity to be a part of it, because even for them, maybe just even being there and, experiencing the loss of their grandpa with their cousins could be everything to them. Or drawing a picture and putting it in grandpa's casket, or a letter. We get a lot of poems or colors. Kids are very descriptive. I know when we talk about cremation, I'm going to put an experience on this. We describe, because they were going to look at this box and say, how did grandma or grandpa get in that box? Because that's what kids are. They're concrete. They understand that obviously a human body can't be put in that box. So how does this happen? And you explain it like when you're going up camping and you have a bonfire. What happens to all the twigs? These twigs that make this huge pile. What happens to them? And they understand. Oh, they become ashes. They become dust, dirt. Well, that's what happened to grandma. That's what happened to grandpa. They understand little things that they can wrap their head around. You don't have to tell them that you're putting them in a furnace, or you don't have to go into how hot the things are. But I think if you give them a little bit, and they'll ask you more. We both have children, and my children are very, very much talkers, especially my daughter. And if they need to know more information, they're going to ask you. So, I've actually listened to a couple podcasts on this, and I've also heard a couple funeral directors, and everybody has their own way to deal with children. And I think that's the one thing, if you are a funeral director out there, get a little knowledgeable about this, because I do find that some funeral directors are as scared as these parents are to talk to kids. And I think sometimes we get lost in, okay, well, the kids aren't paying the bill. They're here with the parents that we got to make sure are getting taken care of, and you lose track of the kids. And sometimes you can be the one that kind of gives these parents some relief, because you have the experience, and you're going to hear things that are going to be, oh, that makes sense. I may use that next time there's a young boy that's scared, or a young girl that, stays in the back and is very timid, that you can do. And then the parents watch you, and they're like, oh my gosh, I will remember this for if I have to ever talk to a kid, and it just gets passed on and passed on. I think the one thing we lose track of is, especially for us funeral directors, and let's be honest, we're salesmen too. This is our future. So if they remember, oh my gosh, I remember when, and we get this all the time, they'll say it to my dad, I remember when you had this conversation. My dad has a conversation. He talks to all the children when they first come in and they have their family hour. And he discusses why grandpa feels the way he does with the embalming process, and why we put what we call medicine inside them, because they don't need to know, the actual chemistry behind it or biology. They just need to understand, oh, okay, when grandpa gets sick, we usually would put a medicine in him to stop him from coughing. Mm-hmm. Or, when I get sick, usually mom gives me medicine. That makes sense. They're putting something in him to take care. And then obviously grandpa's heart is not working, so he's going to be what the temperature in the room is. So you have them touch a chair in the room and say, does that feel like, do you know what your temperature is? And usually, you got the older girl, that's the smart one, 98.6 or whatever. And you're like, okay, what does a 98.6 day feel like? And then say, but feel this chair, and that's why grandpa feels that way, because his heart is not pumping blood anymore.
He's room temperature.
No, so you can explain that, and then we also say why boxes are so important, and you explain it like, okay, when it's your birthday or when it's Christmas, if you're religious, what happens? And they go, oh, we get presents, and what do the presents usually come in? And they're like boxes, and they're like, okay, well, the fancier the present, usually the fancier the box. And then we always kind of throw in the joke, because there's always a young girl present. Someday you may get very lucky, and someone might get down on one knee, and if they don't have that little box, you say no, and that kind of gives a joke out of everybody. But it makes sense if you can just, because kids are visual. They're visual, visual creatures, I guess. Warn them what's going to happen. Warn them that they're going to go into a room. Grandpa's going to be in a box, or grandma's going to be in a box, or brother's going to be in a box. There's going to be people that are crying. And that's another thing, too. Don't hide your emotions from your children. I think that's another big problem that parents have, especially the masculine men.
Well, it's humanizing
We don't
experience.
cry in front of our, or you always hear it at funerals, and
But it's okay not to cry too.
it is, but it's okay to show them that you love this person, it hurt, and that's why you're crying.
Right. But I think it's okay not to too. I think that's important to talk about. Because I think,
some people just don't have that.
because I think a lot of kids go in there and either A, don't cry or cry, and they are questioning, why did I cry or why didn't I cry?
Or am I crying
am I
just
wrong
because
for
Mom,
crying or not crying?
or why am I
You're
crying?
not wrong
And-
for
and-
either way. Everybody grieves differently, and that's the important part.
No, and I agree with you on that, because there are some people that internalize and they need to release their grief in other ways at different times, or maybe I'm glad, Papa, Grandpa's not in that pain anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe why I'm not,
Right.
But yeah, I think the idea is just if you explain it that it's okay to do this, it's okay to do that. This is what your experience is going to be when you go in there. This kind of relate the room to them.
So one of the things I did a discussion with, I did a little lecture, if you will, with some funeral directors about kids and grief and what to do, what not to do. And one of the big issues that came up was liability. We don't get trained, according to the funeral directors that I was talking to, we don't get trained to do this. So what if we make a mistake? And I think the biggest thing I would like to say to any funeral director that's worried about liability is that, educate yourself. It's important. What you guys do is a big deal. It is a super important part to the grieving process. And I think if you don't have any education on how to talk to kids with grief, I think you're missing out on some very important discussions that could potentially help psychologically for that child growing up. For example, the biggest problem is a lot of parents aren't educated on death and grief and aren't comfortable with it. Being a funeral director, I think it's important for all of you men and women out there to educate, because the thing is there's not a lot of education out there. So if you guys are scared to talk to the people, that's who is going to. Yeah, you could save it for the psychologist, which hopefully they're educated on it. But the bigger problem is that I think you guys have a tough job. Don't get me wrong, you guys have a tough job. But I think one thing that maybe could be down the road with, CEUs, if you ever guys get around to getting continuing education, would be to have classes on child grief, because it's so important. Just like anything with kids, if kids grow up and see their parents in unhealthy relationships, a lot of them grow up thinking that is the right, that's the norm. Just like grief and loss, if you're teaching them that we don't talk about it, you're not mature enough to go see death, but basically is what you're saying to them, or you lie to them and say something like, "Oh, grandma's sleeping." Right?
That's a no-no.
All these things are going to come up to this kid later in life. They're going to be mad. They're going to be upset. They're going to not understand why they were not allowed to say their goodbyes.
Right.
And I think the important part is that if the funeral director is educated on this, they can tell the parents, "Hey, listen," which we know in psychology, so you guys can take this from this podcast too. The more you can get the children involved, the better it will be for their grieving process. That has been, studied, it's been analyzed, and that's been proven, that the more you can get the children involved in the ceremony to their comfort level. That's the important part. You said it best. Right. What are they comfortable with? Yes, obviously you can't get 8 little kids pallbearing. They're not going to be able to move the casket, right? But they can walk along with the adults doing it. Right. If there's room or space, they could put their hand on the casket. That's an important thing. They will always remember that. That's the most important thing, is that they can remember, yes, I was there. Yes, I got to hold up Grandpa to the hearse.
Yep.
Whether they did or not, it's not the point. The point is that you're allowing them the opportunity to not only be a part of their grandpa or grandma's death, or their parents, but also that it's a memory for them. that it's not such a bad experience to be at a funeral home.
Well, and it's a way that they can say goodbye in their own way, too, especially with grandparents. Grandkids have such a different experience with their grandparents a lot of the time. And nowadays, with both parents working, a lot of the times the grandparents are the ones that are actually, parenting. Or not, I'm not saying that the parents aren't parenting, but they're around. They're the ones that watch them daily and keep them. And so there is a different experience. So especially if that's their first experience and you're not allowing them to be a part of it. It's very crippling. It's very crippling.
Well, and it's a vicious cycle too. If we continue to not educate people, it's just going to go down the line. Then they're going to raise their kids thinking that the best way to do it is to not let their kids come. You know what I mean? It's,
right.
We got to break that cycle, and I think the biggest thing is to educate people.
Maybe something to think about too is there's obviously some different age ranges, Nick. Obviously, a newborn is not going to remember a funeral. He's not going to remember that experience. When you start getting into 2, 3, where you're kinetically playing with toys, you're seeing things, I do think it's appropriate they don't have to do anything, but they could bring them to a visitation. They could see it. They could experience it. And if they want to go, because they might be at that point to say, oh, that's Grandpa. Like you said, I find, Nick, and I think you hit it earlier, is honesty is always the best policy. It's better now to be honest and maybe think that, okay, I wanted to protect my kid from this, but I realize I can't,
But age appropriate, honestly.
But
that's the important part. And don't get me wrong, there is certain things that I wouldn't say to my my daughter's about to turn 2 years old. I'm not going to explain to her what the whole embalming process is.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I'm not going to take her into the morgue and be like, okay, by the way, this is what's going on. No, absolutely not. However, if she asks me a question, I would try to make it age appropriate for her.
Right.
Saying that Grandpa's not with us anymore. He's moved on. He's passed away. He died.
Yeah.
I think another big thing that we tend to do as society is we decrease. We watch what we say. So, for example, most people aren't going to say, "Oh, by the way, Jim died." They're going to say Jim passed away,
right?
Or Jim moved on, and again, that's one more step away from acknowledging
that he died. He is
death.
Gone. He is not coming back. There's a lot of things to say and not to say, and you learn that. And the problem is we're human, so the first thing you think of is how we all doing today. And when this spouse just lost the love of her life to cancer, and she's not gonna have a great day. She's not, but you don't even think about it. It just is second nature, or at least he's not suffering anymore, or he's in heaven. Some people aren't religious, so that to them could be a punch to the face.
I was just reading something the other day. Was really fascinating to me. Was this author was saying, and I can't, for the life of me, I read so many articles, so many books. It's hard for me to keep the authors in track. But he made the argument that the whole dignified, not crying at funerals may have stemmed from JFK, John F. Kennedy, as his wife, because his wife at the funeral did not cry. She stood there. She was very, they said dignified at the funeral.
Okay.
Right. So then it's this idea we're teaching the public to have a dignified grieving process.
Right.
You don't have to show emotions, right? Again, this is the problem is that we're taking things, I think, out of context. Maybe that's how John F. Kennedy's wife had grieved.
Yeah.
She was so much shock, so much what just happened kind of situation. But I think the problem is a lot of people looked at that as, if she can do it without crying, maybe I should.
Yeah, it gets this idea of this is the way to grieve.
Acceptable, right?
Which is
acceptable, non-acceptable.
Which is absolutely horrid because, like we have already talked about, Nick, in countless episodes, everybody grieves differently, and everybody should have the opportunity to grieve in any way they find is beneficial to them. And if that means getting on the floor and punching and kicking the floor, that's what you got to do. If it means that you just need to.
That's what pillows are for, man.
It's absolutely.
I tell that to kids all the time. Go in your bedroom, beat the crap out of your pillow.
Now, something I'm going to flip it around, Nick. Now, we talked about kids going to funerals, but let's flip that around. How about kids being the ones that the funeral's about.
Ooh.
So the death of
That's
an
a-
infant, or the death of a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old. I have had the honor of taking care of children, infants, young adults, anywhere and everywhere in between. Now, obviously, it's less. It happens less. But, that goes back to what you said. Funeral directors have the opportunity to really make a difference.
Absolutely.
And they have an opportunity to somewhat make this very strange journey now for these parents, grandparents, siblings.
And that's why it's so important. I would challenge a lot of funeral directors out there. I know that we're moving to a society where funeral directors more often than not are, hiring services to go pick up the bodies. But I think in some cases it's so, so important for that funeral director to make an appearance at that house when a child is passed on.
Absolutely.
Just to sit there. You don't even have to say anything. It's just so important for them, especially in a time where they just lost everything. I can't imagine losing my child.
Their whole world is definitely
It
flipped
shook up.
upside down.
But I think one of the most important, beautiful things, especially for the local funeral director out there, is that you guys don't know how important you are to the families that
Right.
you serve.
Right.
And I think more importantly, even if you never are told how important you are for them, we know through interviews and all that stuff that these people need good funeral directors.
Oh,
good,
well, I mean,
compassionate, empathetic people.
It goes back to most people become funeral directors because they either had a really a great experience with a funeral home or a funeral director, or they had a really bad experience and they don't want anybody to deal with it. But you're absolutely right. For them, anything they can put their hands on concrete at that point in their time, I think is important. So you're absolutely right. So you being, and don't even put a suit on, just go out there. Just go out there and say, I'm here if you need me for anything. I'll sit with you.
Yeah.
And honestly, the best thing you can do in those situations is just listen.
Well,
Tell them that you're
just
there.
Just be there. Be present.
Just, yep.
Well, you can also realize that nobody in that situation knows what to tell
No,
that person.
there's-
Nobody.
No.
Not even a funeral director. Not even a grief and loss specialized person that's done their whole life. I think the most important thing is you'll know if you're there and you're empathetic and compassionate and can just sit and listen. You don't know what that will mean to that person.
Oh, I think it's huge, and especially I've noticed a big difference, and I remember Dad telling me, and I'm sure he told you, that it becomes even more difficult when you have children. So as a funeral director, when you're going home, so you're experiencing that, and then you're literally going home and picking up your 2 4-year-old children. So it is a very tough thing, but I will say that anything and everything you can do, especially very, very young children when it comes to the mother. And I'm not putting any stance on fathers aren't as compassionate or loving or emotional, but there's something with a mother, especially when it's a newborn baby, with rocking. And the idea, Nick, we're going to talk about something else, because there is another problem that sometimes you can't do anything because they're at a hospital, and hospitals tend to go take their deceased right down to the morgue. Because they don't want the rest of the hospital seeing, the decedent. So they usually take it down the morgue. So in those situations, there's nothing you can do as a funeral director to see the family, especially if they're in the hospital. But yeah, absolutely. When you get an opportunity to go to visit them, or give them an opportunity to, when you get the baby, after you do your work, you give the opportunity for the mother and the father to come in and spend some time with their baby alone.
Yeah. Again, it's just I think I understand that your guys' job as funeral directors is very tough. It's very time consuming. There's a lot of moving gears. But one thing I would challenge a lot of funeral directors out there is special occasions. You should try to do it for all occasions, but in special deaths, taking the extra time can mean a huge difference to the family.
Absolutely. I think all of us are human, so occasionally we get lost in our own worlds, our own families, or just the families that we're already taking care of.
Well, and I think there's a numbness too. It's just like, this is what you guys do for a day to day. I'm not saying that you guys are heartless. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I think good funeral directors are very compassionate, empathetic, and they're challenging their own emotions on a daily basis, you know, and I think that's an important part of being a good funeral director. And out there, for all you funeral directors, it is okay to go seek out help if you need it. It's super important for any field, especially you guys dealing with grief and loss on a normal basis. That stuff is eventually going to catch up. And if you don't got ways of venting, if you got, you know, have, you know, enough hobbies or, you know, or just need to just kind of clear the head out, go get help, man. Like, we're all here for you as me as a psychologist. Like, I would love to sit with funeral directors. You know, I do have a lot of your guys' experience. I grew up in a funeral home. Unfortunately, I didn't take that path. I took a different path, but I'm here. And also I think it's important, or call another funeral director. You know, you guys have the experience. You guys are a very close niche group of individuals. And I would challenge you guys to talk about your issues with each other.
Now, Nick, how does this equate this children on both sides, whether you lose a child or a child dealing with death for the first time, or maybe even the 8th time, and not having that experience to know how to grieve? How does it equate in the psychology field? What are you seeing?
One of the conversations we probably should have in a future discussion is cremation versus burial, because either way is fine, but one of the biggest things that I think people need is a place to go, right? So with burial, it's nice because the kid or the grandkids can go to a place and drop off letters for grandma or grandpa, or just sit out with grandpa for a little bit. I always loved the idea. My dad, when he would go see his dad at the cemetery, would always knock on the ground above the casket. And I, as a kid, I didn't understand what he was doing. And then one day I asked him, because that's what kids do, they ask questions. He said, well, I always want him to know I came by. And I just think that's so neat that everybody has their own way of grieving, and that everybody has their own tradition, right? And I think to myself, for these parents that lost their child, or these really heartbreaking experience, an 18-year-old that overdosed or something like that, people need a place to just go and vent with that,
right.
The deceased, whether or not they believe in an afterlife or anything like that. I think it's just important for people to be able to go somewhere and know that that person is there.
Well, I think we got some Q&As.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
All right, Nick, I got a Q&A here for you.
All right.
My 10-year-old brother saw a man die. While on the drive back from the family's cabin, my brother saw a dead man lying in the road. He had run in front of a semi-truck and was lying on the road. I'm not sure if he saw the man die or just the body, but he's really freaked out about it and is refusing to talk about it. What can I do to help him? He's only 10, and I don't want him becoming cold to this kind of thing like I am. So first of all, interesting thing about that Q&A is he's addressing that he has a problem with it. So he doesn't want his brother to deal with it. So that's talking about it.
I'm going to guess that who's talking about this is like an older brother to this young
yeah, he's
kid.
trying to keep, he's protecting him.
He's protecting him, but by protecting him, he's not talking about it too. You know what I mean? But the question is, how do we help this 10-year-old? I think the most important thing with this 10-year-old is first of all, even an adult who sees something like this is going to be a little bit traumatized by, or a lot of traumatized by. But for this kid, what I would try to do, if I had him in my room at least, as a therapist, the first thing I would do is focus more about the trip itself. Focus on what happened, what was that like, before this whole situation happened. Did you have a good time? Get them a little bit not so focused on this situation itself. Because the problem is, if you go at you strike at the meat, most 10-year-olds in a traumatized experience, the minute that you hit it, they're going to shy away. I think the more important part is to get them feeling comfortable enough to talk about it. Again, if this older brother here is already saying that he's cold about it, so he's struggling with it, there's always inflections, there's always body language, there's always things that kids are really good at picking up on. Parents always say that they're like, well, you know, I don't think the kids pick up on this. More so than not, the kid is picking up on something. Yeah, they might not be able to express it. They might not be able to put it in language, but they know something is wrong.
Right. When a kid runs through the house and says a curse word that definitely probably came out of your or your wife's mouth,
And especially
and realizing
a
they
kid,
don't know what it means, but they catch on to it.
And in most younger kids look up to their older siblings, right?
Yeah.
So for you, it's super important because he's looking up for you to guidance. If this is an older brother talking here,
Right. And he's already saying he doesn't feel comfortable in that scenario.
Right.
So I think
so even if he talks about it, his body language is probably saying, "Let's not talk about
so.
it."
Maybe before addressing the 10-year-old, maybe we need to address the other questioner.
Well, I think the older brother needs help himself
Yeah,
if
he
he's
needs-
cold about it.
he needs
You
to
know,
have
we
a-
need to warm him up a little bit, warm up the hands a little bit.
Well, I guess we need to know a little more information too. Is he cold about people dying in general, or is he cold about this guy being basically like without like the truck driver knowing he ran out in front of a truck driver being like killed? Like, is that the idea?
Or was it just cold on the way home?
I think that's too literal.
I don't know. Kids are very literal. But anyways,
Yeah,
I
I
digress.
think that the real answer is he needs to get help before he can help his brother. It's one of those sayings like you can't really help somebody if you can't help yourself. Like you can't be
Right.
comfortable in a situation that you're not comfortable in. So if maybe you don't feel like you're comfortable enough in it, maybe find somebody else that is.
Or what would even be a better idea, a better solution is maybe the parents send both the brothers in together, which would be super, I think, really good for the younger one because then he's not alone.
right, and
You
he
know,
says, "Oh,
and his older brother's
it's-
getting help, so it's cool to get help.
It's,
you know,
and it's okay because Sammy's uncomfortable about this.
Yeah.
we just played baseball,
and it's okay to be. I think the biggest thing I would say, it's okay to be cold about this. This is not something that you should be. I would be more worried about a kid that saw something like that and no big deal.
Yeah, that's kind of
You know what I'm saying? Like that's a good sign that they both are feeling this. It's important that they go to a place where they can feel it.
right, and not become numb by it.
Well, or not be able to talk about it. Let's not talk about that. You know, let's save that for a later date. Well, if they keep being told that and they never get it out, it's a problem.
Right. Right.
So-
Okay, here's the next question. How do I explain a recent death of a grandparent to my 4-year-old? My 4-year-old's grandmother and grandfather recently passed. She didn't seem fazed by it when it happened, but months later, she keeps bringing it up. What should I do? Now, I'm going to answer this one first because this is something that we learned. When it comes to young kids, a lot of them will allow, well, they don't know they're doing it. They're subconsciously doing it, but they allow their parents to grieve first before they grieve. So it's a really interesting play because as parents, you think, I need to help my children grieve, and then I can take the grieving on myself. The problem is in that situation is 10 to 1, you're grieving, and your kid is seeing that, so they think, I need to help mommy and daddy get through this before I know what I can do, and I know I can be there emotionally. So a lot of kids actually grieve 6 months to a year or two down the line because they didn't feel it was necessary for them to grieve while mommy and daddy are grieving. So this isn't new news that months later this comes in because it might have taken. Is it a daughter? Did you say 4-year-old? It might have taken the 4-year-old that long to experience the grief and go through the process. They could have been in denial for that 4 months, or they could have had something else. A lot of times, the next anniversary of something. So Christmas comes up. Grandma and Grandpa are there. That brings up feelings. Or this is the time Grandma would usually make her snickerdoodle cookies. No snickerdoodle cookies.
So good.
And Mom makes them, but let's be honest, they're not.
Mom's subpar to grandma's cookies.
It's not that good. So a lot of that times there is a lot of new anniversaries that bring up a lot of emotions. So what should you do? I think you just let her grieve the way she wants to. If she's bringing it up, she obviously wants some answers, or she just wants to be heard. He wants to be heard. I keep saying she. I don't know why I keep thinking that, but I think the kid just wants to be heard, and maybe he's bringing up things or she's bringing up things because she didn't know how to explain those things, or maybe they're starting to realize that maybe it's okay maybe they thought for a while, because that's a lot of what kids do too, is I can't bring it up at the dinner table because it's going to really make mommy sad. I don't want to make mommy sad. So maybe now they feel like, oh, okay, now I feel comfortable. I mean, it is a 4-year-old, but there's a lot of very intense 4-year-olds out there. I know for a fact.
So developmentally, I think this is where we're going with this. So a 4-year-old kid, first of all, is not going to ever want to make mom and dad mad. Right. So if mom and dad are angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, they shut down.
Right.
Also, at that same time, a 4-year-old is just starting to understand more complex situations, such as death. 4-year-old, I would challenge, a 4-year-old can actually somewhat understand what's going on. A 2 and a 3-year-old's tough, depending on the kid. And again, everything I say with developmentally, you have to go with every kid is differently. I've met some 4-year-old kids that are super, in tune, super can pick up on things a lot better than other 4-year-olds. Not saying one is better. It's just sometimes people progress differently through the stages of development. So a 4-year-old kid, you're saying, they lost both grandparents, which, wow, if we're saying that was close, that's tough in general. And now we're saying one of the parents just lost both of their parents recently. I don't know about anybody else listening to this, but if I lost both my parents in a year, that'd be a really rough year for me. So I just think of my, little ones. They're really little right now, but either way, they would pick up on something's wrong with dad.
Right.
They're not sure what it is.
You're going through the orphan complex at that point.
Yeah.
Losing both of
Right.
your
parents.
Your parents. You're an orphan.
First of all, if you don't feel comfortable with the idea of talking about your parents who you just recently lost, maybe you need to go seek out therapy. 1, 2, if you're not able to do that, or you're just not you're uncomfortable with both talking about your parents and seeking out therapy, you really need to get help for this kid. Now, does that necessarily mean it has to be a therapist? No. You can go to the local funeral director. A lot of them are really good at talking to kids.
Support groups.
So yeah, nonprofit organizations out there. There's a lot of grief ones out there that if you're lacking in funds,
there's like a lot of summer camps too they can go to with other children.
Doesn't
that
have
lost
seek out help. My answer to you would be just be honest with the kid.
Yep.
Talk to him. Say, hey, I just realized that you're struggling. What's that about? You don't necessarily have to say, oh, is this about grandpa or grandma? Maybe it's not about grandpa or grandma. Maybe it's just the dynamics in the family have changed because grandpa and grandma have passed away.
Right, and maybe just be honest that I'm struggling too. So let's work on this together. So yet again, they don't feel isolated. They don't feel alone.
Well, and I think another big thing that we keep touching on is that parents need to humanize themselves to their kids. Kids need to learn that parents are not always right.
We're not always superheroes.
Sometimes you can be, but most of the time, even superheroes fail.
Yeah, they do.
Batman fell sometimes.
You don't want to bring kryptonite.
You got to keep coming back up. Batman didn't have anything to do with kryptonite. That was Superman. I said Batman.
Clark.
You didn't say Superman.
Kent.
I said Batman.
Okay.
Anyways, moving on.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think that sums it up, Nick. Sums it up.
Well, and if you have if you have any other questions or any other concerns that we didn't hit on with child grief, please email us.
Our email is letstalkaboutdeathpod@gmail.com. Feel free to leave us any thoughts, and if you don't feel comfortable with Gmailing us, feel free to find us on our Instagram, Let's Talk About Death, or our Facebook, where you can direct message us.
We will keep everything anonymous unless you want us to say your name. If you are very adamant about your question and you want your name addressed, we will do that. But if you don't say anything, we're not gonna blast your name on our show.
We're just gonna talk about it.
We're gonna talk about death, and if you're not talking about death, then you're not living.
You ain't living.